So as we continue looking at the individual characters, so Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, one of the things I like to do is in discipleship, I'll make the note on this when we get to Nehemiah, is look at lessons in spiritual leadership, lessons in what does a faithful leader look like, and do character studies on each of these three leaders, Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and it's helpful to understand where we're at in the story. They find themselves back in the land, trying to figure out how to lead God's people when everything seems to have kind of blown up in their face. And they're great character studies. And so if you look on page 165, let's get our understanding first and we can go make disciples and teach them what this looks like. Here's Zerubbabel's story. He's grown up in exile, just like all the Jews at this moment, and at most all the Jews during this period. And at the decree of Cyrus, remember the Persians say, let's get people back in their land. He's going to be in the first waves. We're on page 165. The decree of Cyrus has allowed for Jews to return. And Zerubbabel is sent back with a very specific task. It's number 2. His task is to rebuild the temple of Yahweh. And his reasoning is very clear. The temple is where Yahweh dwells. The temple is how we know God is with us. It's how we gain access to Yahweh. It's how we worship and serve Him. Now, as they come back to rebuild the temple, what's going to happen is they're going to begin to experience opposition. I'm sure you know, often the most difficult tasks in life come with great difficulty and opposition. And sometimes it comes with years of challenges, and that same thing is going to take place in Zerubbabel. That's why these are such great character studies, because they are so true to life. And some of that opposition is going to be very simple. They're going to experience some internal opposition, as some people that come back with Zerubbabel are going to remember the old temple, and they're going to go, this is so small compared. This is nothing. And then there's going to also be external opposition, as people are going to oppose the rebuilding of the temple. We're going to see the very same thing with Nehemiah. And as they experience this opposition, that gives us the context for these 2 prophets. Remember, 3 builders, 3 prophets. Zerubbabel has 2 prophets that go with him. Those 2 that go with him are Haggai and Zechariah. And those 2 prophets are essentially sent to say, finish the job of building the temple, especially Haggai. That is Haggai's message. Don't quit. Build the temple. Get to work. We need the temple so that this is where Yahweh meets with us so that we can be the blessing to the nations. It's the same drawing, that same picture we've been working with. We are constituted as God's people around worship of Yahweh and faithfulness to Him, and we take that blessing out to the nations as a kingdom of priests and a royal nation. And then Zechariah is going to pick up on that same idea, but Zechariah is going to be talking about what's it going to look like when Yahweh returns. We need Yahweh to return. Where's He going to return? In the temple. So build the temple. Get to work building the temple. Now here's our commendation on page 166 for Zerubbabel. Number 1, he brought that first wave of what we call the remnant back to Jerusalem. He laid foundation for the rebuilt temple, and later he completed it. And the finishing on page 166, you can write, he later completed the temple. And you can write next to that, 515 BC is when the second temple begins in Israel. Their second temple is now built. Now let's look at the other 2 builders. We looked at Zerubbabel and his 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. Now let's look at our next 2 builders, Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is going to have a problem. He's going to show up. He's going to find himself showing up in Israel, showing up to the temple, and yet the people are still going to struggle with unfaithfulness. They're still going to struggle with trusting Yahweh. After all they've been through, after all these years, after all these centuries, after the exile, the people are still going to find themselves struggling with trust in Yahweh. And isn't that just like you and me? Don't we find ourselves struggling often just to trust God after all He's done? After Him carrying us through even the most difficult of things, it's our trust and loyalty to Him that He is after. And that's what we see. Look at the bottom of, on page 167, the bottom of this long quote, Ezra 9, verse 4. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel, they all trembled because the faithlessness of the returned exiles. And they gathered around Ezra, while I sat and appealed until the evening sacrifice. Ezra is a pastor. Ezra is a leader. He is trying to get the people to trust Yahweh again. And we would say that Ezra he's one of the primary parties that is responsible for putting together our Hebrew Old Testament. Many scholars think that Ezra has a huge hand in pulling together the prophetic voice, the stories of ancient Israel and how they failed, and also gathering the Torah and forming that around this thing we now know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Why is he doing this? Because the people were faithless. The reason they went into exile is faithlessness. They didn't trust Yahweh. And so Ezra's saying, let's not make the same mistake twice. Let's be faithful to God. Here's our book that's going to help us. And he began to gather these pieces together. Ezra, in the same way that Daniel had done, will model this amazing prayer of confession. Look at Ezra 9. At the evening sacrifice, I arose from my fasting with my garment and my cloak torn, and fell upon my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God. By the way, posture in prayer is really important. Posture in prayer, posture in worship, posture in our devotion to the Lord. C.S. Lewis has this comment in the Screwtape Letters where he talks about, I think it's in chapter 4, if you have that copy, go look it up, where he talks about that humans so often forget that the posture of our body is helpful for our brain and our soul to be clued in as to what we're saying and doing. And so posture is really important. Look at the posture of Ezra here. And he says, "Oh my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens." He is modeling this prayer of this first person plural pronoun, we, as he prays on behalf of the people. And then the people respond. Look at Ezra 10. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel, for the people wept bitterly. What we're going to see in Nehemiah is Ezra gathered the entire nation together in Jerusalem and built essentially a stage, a platform. And the people, imagine this in a worship service. He would sit to teach, and he would just read the entirety of the Torah. He would sit down and read it all day long while the people stood and responded to Yahweh. This is a helpful model for what it is that we are doing. Nehemiah, in the book of Nehemiah, describes this event. It says Ezra would read a long section and then he would translate it, or he would give the sense of it. That becomes a model for what we now know as a sermon. We read a section of Scripture and then try to make sense of it so that people can trust and follow Yahweh. That's the point. That's why we study the Scripture. And Ezra is one of our models for this. Now, our last builder is Nehemiah. So you have Zerubbabel, who rebuilds the temple. Ezra rebuilds the people around the Torah and faithfulness to Yahweh. And now Nehemiah and the walls. Now, we might have to just have an understanding. Walls of a city in the ancient culture were very important. It was the walls of the city that made it possible for you to defend your city, defend your people. It was where trade happened. It basically meant that you were a legit nation if your city had a wall. If they didn't, you were on the JV team, essentially. And so as Nehemiah grows up in Persian exile, he will find himself with this burden to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He grows up in the king's court. He's in Artaxerxes' court, and I love the book of Nehemiah. It's an awesome study. He grows up in Persia, in the king's court. And what he does is he makes a request of the king. Would you grant it? Now, keep in mind, he's going to the most powerful king in the known world at that time, who all the people think is a god, a divine being, or a descendant of a divine being. And he goes up to that divine power and says, "Hey, can I have permission to go and rebuild my own nation's walls? And hey, by the way, will you give me money to go do that?" And he's terrified to do this. Why is he terrified? Because he's assuming that such a request will end in his death. He's assuming that Artaxerxes will go, "How dare you ask such a thing," and kill him. But the favor of the Lord is with him. And what we see is Nehemiah will be sent to rebuild the walls. And if you look on page 168, you can see this boxed out for you, but I actually want to encourage you in your discipleship. So as you're discipling people, if you're a cell group leader, a small group leader, community group leader, whatever that may look like for you, one of my favorite studies that I do with people that I disciple is we take the book of Nehemiah, we do like 2 or 3 chapters a week, and I'll just ask the guys that I disciple, read Nehemiah, these 3 chapters. And I don't want you to get like deep into the weeds. I just want you to look for leadership principles. What does a spiritual leader who trusts in Yahweh look like? And then write them down and just write a spiritual leader, or a man of God, or a woman of courage, ... and just start writing them out. Here's 20 of them printed for you, but I think we can find even more than that. And it's a great study. You just get together over the coffee shop, at your house, on your deck, or whatever that may look like in your living room, and just go, what leadership principles did y'all find? It's an awesome study to go in and look. Now, we're going to see the last of our prophets. So 3 builders, 3 prophets. The last of those prophets is Malachi. Malachi is talking about the return of Yahweh to his city, because they've built the temple, they've tried to rebuild the people, they've rebuilt the walls, and yet the glory of Yahweh has not returned. Where is Yahweh? We've come back from exile, we're back in the land, but Yahweh has not returned. And Malachi, as this final book in what is now our Old Testament, what Malachi is talking about is, when will Yahweh return? And you can see, chapter 3, from the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes, have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord. The question in Malachi is, when will Yahweh come back? And if you notice in the box on page 169, Haggai is saying, rebuild the temple. Zechariah is saying, rebuild the temple. And Malachi is saying, but the people are still not faithful. Yahweh still has not returned. And that will close the last of our, we might say, prophetic voices in the Old Testament. And we're going to turn and look at the nations in what we call the silent years that rule and reign over the people of Israel.